All right, so to start off, make sure that you take your attendance, and if you're in person, do your contact tracing. And then you're going to do this Edpuzzle. There is a section in the interactive notebook for you to finish that's paired with this material, and then you're going to do an exit ticket after you finish the interactive notebook. I think after today's interactive notebook section, if you're on Tuesday, that means it's section 1, and if you're on Wednesday, it means that it's section 2. Make sure you turn it in, because the next class that we have, you're actually going to be working on something separate on a Google form instead of this interactive notebook. So again, make sure you turn in your interactive notebook today. Okay, so let's do the do now question first. It says, we know that that natural selection can change a population over time. What other factors can you think of that also have that ability, right? What kind of things can cause a big change inside of a population? I'll give you an example. Natural disasters are an example. What else? Right, you can't use mine. What else? Right. There are other factors like human impact. For example, we could be causing artificial selection to happen. Human impacts also are like human impacts on the environment, right? If you clear a whole area for farming, then you're destroying a habitat of animals, and that will cause them to change over time and adapt as well. So there are many examples, but those are some of the big ones, right? So the big easy ones. Our learning objective today is that learners will be able to analyze other mechanisms of evolution like genetic drift, gene flow, mutation, and recombination. So these things are other things that cause changes inside of populations that we'll call adaptations, right, over a long time, and then that over a long time causes natural selection. So what is a population? Remember, a population is an interbreeding group of individuals of one species in a given geographic area. So they all have to be in the same area, and they all have to be the same species in order to be considered a population. So the example I'm giving here in this picture is a population of frogs in a pond, right? They're all the same type of frog. They can all interbreed and make more babies of more frogs, and they all live in the same pond. That is a population. A gene pool. Now, inside of each population, there is a gene pool. And the idea is kind of weird, especially because we were just talking about frogs and we're talking about a body of water like a pond, right? This is separate. A gene pool is separate. It's just its own term. So it's called a pool because when you pool everything together, for example, if you and your friends all have a little bit of cash, but not enough to go and buy a full meal set at McDonald's, then you can pool your money together in order to buy the larger set that you want. For example, if you're trying to get 20 nuggets instead of just, if you can't even afford a couple by yourself. So that's what pooling is, right, in this idea. The gene pool is the same idea. It's not actually the one that you're jumping in the summer. So each population contains a collection of genes called a gene pool. As the gene pool changes, the population evolves. These changes in the gene pool can happen in several ways, and we'll talk about those. So here we have a population of frogs. And as you can see, most of the frogs are green, so they have green genes. Their DNA says, I'm a green color, okay? But we also have 2 blue and 1 red. And that means inside of the gene pool, if you're just counting the number of genes inside this population, we're no longer assigning them to separate frogs, right? The frog's individuality no longer matters. We don't care about their personality. We don't care about any of their other genes. We don't care about how old or how young they are. We just care about the gene that they have that tells you what color the frog is going to be, right? So in this gene pool, we have mostly green genes, and then we also have 2 blue genes, and we have 1 red gene. And that's the gene pool for color of frogs inside of this population. Another example here of a gene pool is that these are some wild pigs, okay? And these wild pigs have different genes. So this one over here has a capital B, lowercase b. This one over here has 2 capital B's, so it's dominant, right? This one has 2 little b's, 1 big B, 1 little b, 2 little b's, 2 big B's, and 1 big B, 1 little b. And inside of the gene pool, they all become individual letters. But that means that all of these letters in here come from them. So if there's 2 big B's here, then there's 2 big B's somewhere in here. There's 2 big B's here, then there's 4 big B's in here somewhere, right? So it should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 big B's in here. And there should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 little B's in here, okay? The gene pool is just pulling all of the genes together inside of that population. Here we have another term. We have the term genotype and we have the term phenotype. Okay, genotype is the literal genetics of an organism. So when we say gene pool, we're talking about genotypes, right? We're talking about their literal DNA, like the strands of information that code for their existence. Now, a phenotype is an organism's physical traits. So what they actually show as a character trait on their outsides, right? For example, what color fur they have, how long their legs are, right? How pointy their teeth are, right? The pattern on their fur, how fast they run. Those are all phenotypes. Those are all physical traits, right? So think physical, phenotype. They both begin with that PH, and it's an easy way to remember, right? Genotype, genes, genetics. Okay, so here in this picture, you can see that genotype is the chromosomes or the coiled DNA inside of their nuclei, right? And then the genotype directly codes for a phenotype or directly translates into a phenotype, right? So the genotype right here for S directly translates into straight wings, right? So the wings on this fruit fly are straight. And then over here, the W gene, that's not the same as the S, but both code for wings, causes the fly here to have wrinkled wings, right? So we already know that one of them is probably better at flying than the other, and that's just because of this gene inside of their DNA. So the phenotypes are the actual physical wings, and then the genotypes are the DNA that you can't see with the naked eye. Mutations. So a change in gene pool is caused, a mutation is a change in the gene pool caused by the insertion, deletion, or substitution in the DNA sequence, right? The DNA is like this long strand of a bunch of letters as we see it. And when you change those letters, that's a mutation. So it can be caused by random chance, it can be caused by UV rays from the sunlight, it can be caused by chemical exposure, right? And it doesn't really matter if it happens in your body or your somatic cells. It only really matters if it happens in your gametes or your sex cells, like in your sperm and your eggs, right? Because those are the ones being passed on to your kids. So if it changes there, that means your kids are going to also have that mutation, okay? So what do you think this does to the genetic variation of a population? Does it increase it or decrease it, right? Mutations are going to increase genetic variation because they're creating combinations of DNA and new instructions of DNA that didn't exist before, right? Sometimes this is good, sometimes this is bad, right? So here we have a mutations example. So an insect has a mutation that allows it to tolerate certain pesticides. What will happen over time as the population continues to be exposed to the pesticides? Well, we already know that pesticide resistance is a thing, right? So inside of this population, originally we have this whole population of bugs. This is our gene pool of our insects. And we unknowingly have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that are resistant, right? You don't know because you can't tell physically if their genetics are telling them that they're going to be resistant or not. And so you have this plant, it goes, and it flies over the crops, and all the bugs are inside the crops. And then it sprays down all of these pesticides. And so a lot of the bugs are dying because these pesticides are killing them. But we know that the resistant ones are surviving. And so when the resistant ones are better at surviving and reproducing, that means in the next generation, in the next year, when they are growing on these crops, there are going to be more that are resistant. So you see more red dots. And the plant's going to go over and fly over and spray all of the plants again with these pesticides, and the bugs on these plants are going to die. But are all of them going to die? No, because we know that some of the red ones are the resistant ones, and there are more red ones than before. So that means these red ones are definitely going to survive and reproduce even more inside. The gene pool of the next generation has even more red resistant genes in it, right? So more individuals of insects are resistant. And as this goes on year and year and years along the lines, then you might even have a population that is completely resistant to this pesticide. And in that case, that means that we as humans have now created pesticide resistance, and we're going to have to change our pesticide and use a new kind of chemical that hopefully these bugs are not resistant to. And originally, basically, these resistances are just random chances of happening, right? Bugs can be born, or their eggs are laid that have a genetic mutation inside of them that happen by chance to let them survive better against this chemical that's being used. And that's just luck. Honestly, it's just luck in nature. Genetic drift. So what does the word drift mean when you think about it? Yeah, so drift technically means like to float away, right? If you've ever watched the Titanic, Jack and Rose, they float away from each other at the end when they're like freezing inside of the water. So genetic drift is change in a gene pool caused by chance. So what do you think this does to genetic variation? Genetic drift is one that tends to decrease genetic variation. So let me show you an example. So genetic drift, as an example, if a flood kills 95% of a worm population in a certain area, right? So you have this nice garden, and it gets flooded because it doesn't have good irrigation, and it rains for 4 days in a row. So the worms are drowning, and 95% of them just die. They just straight out drown, okay? What will that do to the gene pool for the worms? So you originally have all these different genes, right? So you have these blue genes and these yellow genes, and it's about 50-50 mix, just by chance. And so this is called the bottleneck effect, because it's like when you pour something out of a big bottle with a tiny little neck, right? If you're pouring something with a big bottle and a tiny neck and you pour out of that little opening, is it going to come out fast or come out slow? It's going to come out a lot slower, right? That's compared to like if you have a big beaker and it's a large opening and you just pour it out, it's going to come out really fast because there's a big opening. We call it the bottleneck effect because only a few survive. And so basically it's like you're pouring out a little bit at a time, and whatever comes out is what survives. It's just by chance. Whoever's at the front of the line is going to survive. So in this bottleneck effect of the worms, there's only 2 yellow ones that have yellow genes that survive, and then the rest of them that survive are all blue. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 are blue, and then 2 are yellow. That means that the new surviving individuals have to repopulate, right? The joke is like if you're on an island and you survive, then you have to repopulate on that island because there's not that many options, but all the humans are gone, right? So these worms have to repopulate, and that means that this new generation that is going to be made out of them, it's going to have the same ratio of blue to yellow. So over here, we have a lot more blue than yellow. And so in our next generation, we're going to have mostly blue and a few yellows. And that's super different from the parent population, the original 100%, because they had about half and half yellow and half blue, right? So this next generation in the bottleneck effect is actually decreasing variation because it's decreasing how many different kinds of genes there are inside of this pool. And here, it actually changes the ratio of the genes really badly too. So again, does genetic drift increase or decrease genetic variation? That's right, it decreases genetic variation. So the next term we're going to talk about is called gene flow. What do you think flow means to you when you just say it? Flow generally means like movement, right? Flow like a river, there's a flowing movement of something moving from one place to the other. So in a river, obviously, it's water moving from a higher to a lower location. So gene flow is change in a gene pool caused by movement of organisms into or out of a population. So here we're talking about immigration and emigration, right? We're talking about movement of organisms, we're talking about movements of individuals, because when you move, you take your genes with you, right? So if you're in a population, your genes are in that gene pool. But if you leave that population and go somewhere else, then your genes are going with you to that new population. So you're taking your genes from this gene pool, moving them, and then putting them into another gene pool, right? So you could be changing things in the ratio of the genes inside of each pool just by moving between them. So think about it. When organisms move into a population, do they increase or decrease genetic variation? Find this box right here. The answer is that they are going to be increasing genetic variation. Okay? So when an organism moves out or leaves a population, are they going to increase or decrease genetic variation? They're going to be decreasing, right? Because you're taking your genes out of that gene pool. So that gene pool now has less genes and less variation and less kinds of genes, especially if you had a special variant of a gene. So a gene flow example here is a group of beetles breaks off from the group and finds a new population. The group brings new genes to a new gene pool. To a new pool. So here we have 2 populations of beetles, and one of them is brown tan beetles and one of them is green beetles. Now, originally, the only genes here are green genes. So there's green, 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 green. And over here, there's only that brownish color. I don't know if you want to call that brown or pink. We'll call it tan, okay? There's tan, 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 tan. But one of the tan beetles leaves the tan population and then moves over to the green beetles. That means that over here, it's losing the genes of this beetle, and so the variation here has decreased. And over here, the greens are gaining 1 tan gene now instead of their gene pool, which means now instead of being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 green, there are 6 green and 1 tan. So they have increased in variation. So gene flow in increases variation and gene flow out decreases variation. So the easy way you can remember is in increases, right? In increases, right? Out decreases. It's a little harder to remember. So in increases. So what is a species? Just to kind of, remind, a species is a group of organisms that is capable of producing fertile offspring. Now, what does fertile mean? Right? If you think about it in the terms of gardening, fertile means like you put fertilizer down and then grow a lot. But in a sense of species and offspring, we want to think about fertile means able to produce babies. Okay? So a species is able to breed with each other and then produce babies, and those babies can breed with each other more and then produce more babies. So that's a species. If you can't mate with each other, then you're not the same species. If you can mate but you can't produce babies that can produce more babies that can produce more babies, then you're also not the same species. So the delay in telling is sometimes a little later along the reproductive line, But if you can't keep on producing babies from these two individuals, then that means that they are not the same species. So speciation is the formation of new species, right? If you're in different species and you try to breed together again and it doesn't work out and you can't make babies, or you can't make babies that can have babies, then technically you've been species. You're a different species. Okay. So it's a pretty easy term. Speciation is the formation of new species, right? It's like if you combine the word species with Asian, the formation, right? The Asian part and the species part, it just becomes one word together. So geographic isolation is a way that speciation occurs, right? The physical separation of members of a species often results in speciation. So if you can't interact with other parts of your community, then eventually you'll adapt to your own environment separately and you never see them and you become more and more and more different. And then one day, maybe if you do interact, you're like, wait, we're completely different species now. We can't even mate with each other anymore, right? So here originally in this picture, these 4 kinds of squirrels were actually originally one species in one group, one population of squirrel. But the tectonic plates shifted and they created this valley in between, and some of the squirrels population ended up staying at the bottom of each of the sides of the canyon and some of them stayed at the tops, right? So if you're really, really physically far away from each other, you're no longer interacting. And then while you're not interacting anymore, you're also adapting to only your environment. So the squirrels that lived above didn't have as big of a tail because they didn't need to keep as warm, right? The squirrels with smaller tails were the ones that were surviving better because they could run around faster, right? And then their tan bodies, the squirrels that were tan were surviving better because the birds couldn't see them as well. So eventually they started looking different from the ones at the bottom, right? And then the ones at the bottom needed the tail to stay warm because it's cold where there's less sunlight. And the darker ones survived better because they were blending in with the shadows better at the bottom of the caverns, right? Sorry, at the canyons. So eventually they physically separated into 4 separate species when they originally were one, just because of physical separation and them adapting to each of their own 4 respective areas. So here's another example where you have salamanders, and these salamanders were all originally the same species, but they were all along this riverbed. And because they only stayed in their own separate areas and they only adapted to the areas, they became super, super different. And now they can't even breed with each other, even though they're all salamanders. They're different enough, they've speciated enough that they're no longer able to interbreed. So this is the picture again showing that originally you have variation in population of brown beetles. Some are a little bit more green, some are a little bit more brown, and then a river develops in the middle of the population. It splits them up, and one side is now forest and one side is now sandy dirt. And so these beetles on the side of the forest are blending in better when they're green. So the green ones are surviving and reproducing better. And then on the side of the sand and dirt, the brown ones are still surviving and reproducing better. So eventually these populations become different because they are adapting to their separate locations and separate environments. And when you put them back together, after a long time, they've already speciated and they can no longer interbreed because they're so different now. So geographic isolation, does that increase or decrease variation in a population? It depends, right? It can create new kinds of populations, right? So overall, on the balance of species, it creates more species. So now there's more diversity and more variation. Behavioral isolation is another way that works kind of similar to the geographic isolation, except for the fact that it's behavior-based. So it occurs when species differ in their mating rituals, and therefore they do not interbreed. So populations become more and more different when their genes are no longer mixing, and they become new species eventually. The example here I showed you is that these 2 birds, even though they're not super different looking, these are 2 male birds. And you know that birds court using music and using chirping, right? And so these birds, they have different chirping sounds. And honestly, the females of the different populations are the ones that can tell the difference, right? If there are females of this species and they hear this, they're like, oh, they're not even interested because it's not even the same species. They have their own special call. They're like, that's not even like a male bird that I can't even mate with because it's a different species. And so if a female bird of this species hears this song, they're not interested either because that's not their same species. Only when the females hear this song are they like, okay, that's a man's I can get with, right? So then they will go and seek out the male and see, hey, are they going to be a good father to my offspring? And then they might mate and produce babies. But just hearing the different sounds, the females are either attracted to it or not attracted to it because they're different species. Extinction is when a species ceases to exist. So when there is extinction happening, do you think that that's an increase or a decrease in diversity and in variation? The answer is a decrease, right? Because the species is dying out, so they no longer exist. So that would be decreasing variation inside of like all of the animal kingdom. So there are two kinds of evolution, right? Eventually, you'll just kind of follow the trace. There's convergent evolution, which means that similar traits develop in organisms with different ancestors. So convergent evolution is over here. You can see that originally there are two different parent species, two different ancestors, and maybe because of the environment or maybe because they're developing traits that help them survive, they just end up being more and more similar. So an example is like birds and butterflies, right? They both need to fly, so eventually their ancestors both developed wings, and now they both are flying organisms. You also have divergent evolution, where you have different traits develop in a group within a species, often resulting in speciation. And this is where I kind of showed, the beetles that are becoming brown and green, and then also the squirrels that became different colors and had different sizes of their tails because they were just becoming different based on their environments. So divergent is splitting, convergent means to come together. Then the last thing we're going to go over are types of selection. So in any population, there are variations, right? Even in color, in size, in speed of running, right? So there's always variations or differences. And so variations can be extreme or they can be subtle, right? They can be a big difference and they can be a small difference. So there's a whole spectrum, right? We usually go on that spectrum about like a bell-shaped curve. And that means that most of the organisms are in the middle where they're pretty average. And then there's going to be organisms that are on the end over here that are really, really good at something or really, really extremely one color. And then there are organisms on the other end that are extremely maybe bad at something or the opposite color from the other side, right? But most organisms are somewhere in the middle in that curve where the height of the curve is. So it's like having a scale of 1 to 10, right? 1 is the lower end and 10 is the higher end. Natural or artificial selection picks at the variation in a population. So certain degrees of variations are better suited for survival and reproduction. And so sometimes maybe the higher end of the spectrum or the faster running or the darker colored end is better at surviving and reproducing. Sometimes it's the other end, right? Sometimes it's both ends and not the middle. So we'll talk about that. So directional selection means that selection favors one side of the spectrum, and that can be either the lighter side, the darker side, the faster side, the slower side, right? The heavier side, the lighter side. So it causes the unfavored side to have a more difficult time surviving and reproducing. So if the unfavored side isn't reproducing as much, they're not passing their genes on to the next generation, right? So most of the genes of the next generation are going to have this favored gene for survival. The example is that coyotes are getting faster, right? So the rabbits that are slow on this side are getting eaten up, and the faster ones are the ones surviving and reproducing. And that means that if they're the ones surviving and reproducing, the new average is going to be faster, and they're all going to be slightly faster on average in the next generation because the slow ones are all dying. They're not making babies anymore. So that's directional selection, right? We're pushing from one direction. We also have disruptive selection, right? The picture looks like a camel hump, right? Because it's disrupting that normal bell shape that we have right here. And it's changing it into this weird hump shape. So disruptive selection favors both extreme ends of a spectrum, creating more diversity and variation in a population. So the example I'm giving here is that finches are birds that have beaks from small to large. And most of them have an average size beak originally, right, in this red line. This is because their food ranges from small seeds to insects and hard-shelled nuts. Well, what if one year a drought kills off all insects and the medium beak birds lose their main food source? So they slowly starve to death. And so this middle population is now gone, right, the middle-sized beaks. So the birds that have the small beaks are thriving and reproducing. So they're increasing the population. And then the birds that have the big beaks that are able to crack the hard-shelled nuts are also thriving and surviving because their food source is here. But the medium beak-sized birds are dying out because they have no food, right? So just so happens that the environment changed to favor both ends of the spectrum, but not the middle. And that's disruptive selection, right? It's kind of a weird shape, so disrupting the normal shape. And then we have stabilizing selection, which is favoring the middle of the spectrum and making sure that the middle is the best and increases in population. So it causes a decline in variation in population over time. This example is kind of complicated, but try to follow me. So sickle cell disease is a part of a gene that causes a range from severe anemia to being unaffected. So when you have anemia and it's really bad, you don't have enough red blood cells to carry oxygen around your body, you don't have enough iron, you're iron deficient, you pass out really easily, you get tired all the time. And so anemia is kind of, not great to have, but it affects a lot of people. And then there's people on the spectrum who are unaffected right here. So those who have extreme sickle cell disease die from blood clots because their blood cells, instead of being round, they're kind of like this moon shape and they get caught on each other really easily inside of your blood vessels and get clotted, and they can cause heart attacks and strokes, and so people die quite often from that. Malaria is a parasite in a lot of regions, for example, in Africa, where they are carried by mosquitoes, and when you get bitten by mosquitoes too much, they can inject the malaria parasite into you. But malaria is a parasite carried by mosquitoes that requires high blood oxygen levels. So people who have sickle cell disease do not have high blood oxygen levels. They have low blood oxygen levels. It's part of the reason why they're so tired all the time. So people who are unaffected by sickle cell disease die from malaria, because when you have normal blood cells, you have a lot of oxygen, and the malaria loves that, and then malaria will kill you, okay? Only those who are mildly or middly affected by sickle cell disease, which means they have one gene for sickle cell and one gene for not, so they have this kind of blend of sickle cell and not sickle cell in their blood, and they have low blood oxygen levels, are also unaffected by malaria. So people who have sickle cell disease and have mediumly affected don't die from malaria, because malaria doesn't stay alive inside their blood. But we already know that people who have sickle cell disease tend to die early. So it's these people in the middle who have that blend of one sickle cell gene and one non-sickle cell gene, right? They have the benefit of not getting malaria, not dying from malaria. And then they also have the benefit of not dying from sickle cell disease, because they still have some normal blood cells, right? So they're the ones that survive the best, and they're the ones that make babies and reproduce and pass their genes on. So that middle section where they kind of have a little bit effect by sickle cell and don't get infected by malaria, they're the ones surviving and reproducing, so their population increases in size until then it is the highest point, and then there's not very many people who have extreme sickle cell, and there's not very many people who have normal blood cells either, because malaria is killing them all. So in an environment with malaria and sickle cell disease, you get stabilizing selection, or stabilizing that middle to make it stronger and heavier. So you're going to go ahead and do your interactive notebook now, and make sure you turn it in after you do it, and then you have an exit ticket, and that's all for